Welcome to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that connects the food on your plate to the rest of the world, to your health, community, the environment, and the economy. I'm your host, Dana DePrima. Today, we're talking with Chef Gary Podesto, a chef, an educator, and a member of Climate Farm School, an organization that brings people onto farms to learn directly from the people growing their food. At first glance, this might sound like a conversation about farming or maybe one about restaurants, but it's really a conversation about connection, a really important one. For most of us, food arrives with very little context. We buy it, we cook it, we eat it. But somewhere between the farm and the fork, we've lost sight of the people, the places, the systems that make it all possible. Gary spends his time helping people bridge that gap. Through Climate Farm School, participants spend a week on working farms, learning about soil health, food systems, climate, local economies, and the realities farmers face every day. As a chef, Gary adds another layer by helping people experience those lessons through the food itself. In this conversation, we talk about why people are searching for a deeper connection to the land, what surprises them most when they get closer to farming, the role of soil in everything from climate resilience to nutrition, and why understanding food systems can feel overwhelming and empowering at the same time. We also explore the role chefs can play in helping customers understand where their food comes from. More than half of all food dollars in America are spent away from home. That means that restaurants aren't just places where we eat. They're one of the most important places where people learn about food, farmers, and the choices that shape our food system. Whether you're a farmer, a chef, a dedicated market shopper, or someone who simply wants to understand your food just a little bit better, I think you'll find something meaningful in this conversation. Let's dig in.
At the end of the day, it's about getting people onto farms to meet farmers and learn from them. And these are people who are farm curious, who want to learn about food systems, who want to learn about regenerative agriculture. And this is just an avenue to get people to connect with the people who actually do the work. Because I guess in a larger sense, we're addressing an existential need to be reconnected to the land, because our society has disconnected and become alienated from the natural world in so many ways. So bringing people onto land that's in relationship with people who are stewarding it reconnects them to that way of being.
I mean, I hear this too. People want to be more connected to the land. I heard it a lot during the pandemic, but how is this happening in the middle of people moving, being in urban centers and living modern lives with all kinds of technology at their fingertips? Like, why are they reconnecting with the land? And I'm curious what happens when they come there.
I think it shortens the chain of relationships between a consumer, the average person, someone who shops at the grocery store, to the actual production of the food. And because food is so central to everyone's lives, shortening that chain of relationships makes it more real for people. I mean, a lot of concerns and a lot of feelings bring people to places like Climate Farm School, which are essentially educational experiences. But what I think really ends up happening to people is that they have a connection closer to the source of where their food comes from. Just feels different than going on about your day, going to the store and buying all the food that you're going to eat for the week. I think when people show up, they come for a variety of reasons. They may not even know that they're looking for that connection to the land, but there's some draw that's bringing them into the space. And we just try to create the conditions so that they can make connections with each other and with the farmers and with hopefully nature.
What do you think's driving them there?
I ask every participant how they find Climate Farm School. I was in a cohort last week with a group of 12 people, and I asked them all different answers. Education, this group happened to be a good chunk of students, and so their educational path led them there. Other people, it's related to nutrition and maybe a health event, right? But this is kind of a pretty common story. People have a health event, something that happens in their life that causes them to make changes in their diet. And that leads them down on a road of asking questions. And that leads them to the source of what's going on for them. We get a fair amount of people who come because they're starting to understand climate change and food systems' role in that. And so we get a lot of people concerned about climate, and that's kind of where Climate Farm School started. It initially was a program under an online learning platform called Terra, which is specifically oriented toward educating people about climate in a bunch of different sectors. And then there's people who have anxiety about climate change. And another thing that comes up for folks, I think, is when they have kids for the first time, new parents. It creates a whole different sort of set of priorities for people, and they start to reconsider things that they took for granted, like how does the food get to my plate? And what are the implications long term? Thinking longer instead of short term, you start thinking long term because you have kids. What is the life of my children going to be like in 18, 25, 30 years?
What's interesting here is that farms are becoming one of the few places left where people can experience direct cause and effect. In most modern systems, we're disconnected from the consequences of our choices. Food appears on shelves, algorithms shape our attention, and climate change feels distant and abstract. But on a farm, everything becomes visible. Weather affects crops, soil affects nutrition, human care affects outcomes. That transparency seems to create something psychologically grounding for people. It's less about nostalgia for rural life and more about a craving for tangible reality in an increasingly digital and overstimulated world. The fact that people arrive there through climate anxiety, health issues, or even parenthood suggests that these experiences force people to confront how fragile and interconnected our systems actually are. I love the idea that people could think more broadly about farms and their farmers. Like having a relationship with a farmer, you can address your health pre-event, pre-baby, pre-dinner time, and connect with something valuable that you can do for the land and the environment, for your local and regional economy, and for the health of our communities, which leads to all kinds of things, not the least of which is our national politics. And can we bridge a gap as it widens?
I think something that localism really gets right is removing the intermediaries between you and the things that are important to you, removing media and removing screens and like decision makers and things like that. So I think it just feels kind of natural to get a little closer to the source of your food. I mean, a couple generations ago, it was very normal to be in proximity to rural spaces and have access directly to the people who grew the food, or you probably grew it yourself. So I think that's just another sort of result of the alienation, but also just modernization and evolution of society in general. I think that's why so many people feel nostalgic about farms and maybe have like this sort of like cartoonish version of what a farm looks like. It's like old McDonald's, multi-species kind of thing. And I would say that the private interests aren't trying to disambiguate that. They're letting people carry on with this fiction about what farming looks like at a larger scale, when in reality it's a lot of monoculture and it's a lot of factory oriented systems. And so by getting closer, you kind of burst that illusion a bit, which can be hard for people to deal with and accept and realize how much of that traditional way of growing food has eroded.
When people understand it, and then like a morning and like, okay, well, how do we claw it back a little bit for all of these reasons, health and all of it?
I think what's great is that people are curious and people do want to know more for whatever reason, and platforms like Climate Farm School or other sort of media sources like your podcast, for example, it's a starting point for people and it gets them closer to understanding the things that they care about. And hopefully that's what we're doing at Climate Farm School. And one of the great things that I think comes out of our programming is that we create this alumni network, which is this like community of people who then have connections to one another, sharing experiences, sharing resources, that kind of thing, which feels more like a grassroots sort of like community-based in actual connection rather than this more distributed idea of community that we've sort of learned to adopt through things like social media or the internet in general.
Modern life has normalized distance between people and the things that sustain them: food, community, labor, even truth itself. The more intermediaries that exist between us and reality, algorithms, corporations, screens, supply chains, the easier it becomes to maintain comforting illusions about how systems actually function. That's why there's almost a grief process when people get closer to the source of their food and realize how industrialized and how disconnected modern agriculture has become. The nostalgia many people feel toward farms may not actually be nostalgia for farming, but nostalgia for coherence, for a way of living where people felt more directly connected to the consequences of their actions, their communities, and the natural world. What spaces like Climate Farm School seem to offer is not just education, but a rare experience of reality becoming tangible again. So tell me a little bit about the farm itself and then what happens there.
Yeah, this is a great question. So technically, we're not a geographically oriented organization like in one place. We partner with farms. So we have host farms who host us and host our programming, and we invite participants onto different farms all over the place. We have a few locations in California. We do some programming in the Hudson Valley on the East Coast, and we're going to do a course this year up in Washington. And we also partner with farms in Italy. We've done some stuff in the past in Spain, and we did a course last year in Ireland at a cooking school there called Ballymaloo. And that was a really amazing experience, and a 100-acre organic farm that is also a cooking school. So it was very much like tying together these ideas of production and like farm to table in the like shortest possible sense. So the farms vary. The programming is sort of customized to each location with kind of a general overlay of some online learning that happens up until the course week.
And so you're on the farm for a week?
5, 6 days, depends. Yeah.
What farms in Italy?
So we have 2 locations this year, but in previous years, we've just gone to one location. It's called Tenuta de Spinocchia, and Tenuta is one of these old sort of agricultural estates that have been around for hundreds of years, if not longer. And this one, I think, is 2,000 hectares and is like protected land, and also portion of it is privately owned, and they run their own educational programming and residential stays, and they host different workshops and things like that. They're also a functioning vineyard on a small scale, olive oil on a small scale, and they raise this heritage breed of pig.
So it's a little bit like really cool travel mixed in with this intensive learning.
The international ones are great for Americans. It's an opportunity to travel, but also they're unique and you're with people in a different context. But it's still these group sort of like learning experiences. And we've definitely had people describe it as summer camp for adults and, all these different sort of ways of thinking about it, because people take time out of their lives. It requires resources to do it. There is a tuition that everybody pays. And so everybody comes with a certain level of commitment. Lives are busy. And so it's not a small thing. And we're always so grateful that we get as many interested people as do come, because we totally understand that life is busy and hard, and to take a week out of your life could sometimes be very, very difficult. But they do it.
Tell me a little bit about the curriculum.
So there's an online learning component that starts about 3 weeks out from the course. And it's a lot of suggested reading, more generally about food systems. What is the food system? How does it operate? What are the key pieces of it? What are some like current sort of statistics, understanding from international sort of bodies about what it is? And then there's a good component of it about soil health, because that's kind of the key to what regenerative agriculture is. That's how you start to explain what regenerative agriculture is, by understanding soil health. Mm-hmm. And then we reinforce that in the course week with one part of our day as a soil health lecture. And then we have kind of a main assignment, which is to envision what the future food system looks like for you 30 years in the future. And then we wrap up at the end of the course with a secondary assignment, which is how has your vision of the future food system changed? And so this kind of bookends the experience to sort of track what you've learned and how you've integrated new information.
Give me an
Yeah.
example of some of the gaps, for example. Like I envisioned this and now it's all different.
It's so hard to generalize. I mean, I took the Italy course a couple years ago, and I, being a chef, just kind of let my imagination go. And I kind of wrote it in the form of a restaurant review because that's what just kind of came to mind at the time. But I was reviewing this imaginary restaurant in like 2050 that was more like a think tank for like sustainable food systems and all the details of what that restaurant would look like and all the services it would sort of provide and all the organizations that would be attached to it, and it would be encompassing of all the senses and all these things. It was kind of a pie in the sky vision. And then having been on my own journey understanding soil health and regenerative agriculture and how it compares to the current system, I basically came to the idea that like so much of what needs to be done to get to some better future is connecting people to land and understanding that we're basically poisoning the earth by dumping all these chemicals into it. I've understood that organic vegetables are better for us and better for the ecology, but it didn't really dawn on me how small of a slice of the market that the California centric chef perspective is. It really put my own personal perspective and what I've kind of done in my career in perspective to the larger whole.
How did you adjust your restaurant review?
I decided it was silly to sort of frame it that way. And I don't really work in restaurants anymore. And I've become pretty bearish on the idea of the chef owner restaurant, just given the system and just given how society perceives what a restaurant's supposed to be and how chefs are supposed to act and everything that's being asked of people in that kind of business. And it became about impact. You know, how much impact does a chef have on the people in his community? Some have a lot, don't get me wrong, like Jose Andres is just a shining example of a person who can marshal resources and influence perception and shine light on things. And my goodness, like if we didn't have people like him, like what would restaurants be for, really? And he was kind of part of my original vision in this restaurant review. Like he would be one of the owners and one of the chefs. This would be a better kind of vision of the future.
What's interesting here is that the learning seems to happen less through information and more through having your assumptions challenged. People often enter these conversations with strong judgments about why systems haven't changed yet, imagining solutions through a more idealistic or utopian lens. But the deeper understanding comes from realizing how layered and interconnected these systems actually are, economically, environmentally, politically, and culturally. That shift seems to replace simplistic thinking with a more grounded kind of awareness. Instead of asking, why don't we just fix this? People begin to understand the complexity of creating change that is realistic, scalable, and lasting. In that sense, the course doesn't just educate people about food systems. It teaches them to think more systemically, patiently, and practically about transformation itself. The idea that, you could be farm facing and come to a farm for a week and dive into the soil health and all other things and come out on the other side with maybe a utopian ideal to a more practical, like, okay, geez, we really have a lot of work to do. What can I do to impact that?
Yeah, I felt that my work ethic, how I've learned to like apply myself to things that I care about, that's something that chefs definitely learn is how to work hard. And so I knew that I could apply my skills and my knowledge in a better way through education, and that would equal more impact. And so I think that's part of what I learned is that a chef doesn't have to just be one thing. and that there's different ways to connect with people and feed them and tell different stories. So that was definitely a big piece of it. Yeah.
So we're on this great trip and we're learning about soil health. We're also going to eat it,
Yeah. Yeah.
not the soil necessarily, but we're
Sometimes.
going to be
Yeah.
inspired in the same way, but through food. And that's part of what your job is. So
Yeah, I would say my focus more in Climate Farm School is less in the programmatic side and more in just kind of creating like the visceral experience of how food shows up in the courses and giving people a way to, I mean, this is kind of a lofty way to put it, but to actually embody what we're learning, to actually like eat the things. And one of the things I try to do throughout the course is to connect whatever the day's learnings are, whatever the themes are for the day, to the actual meal at the end of the day. So, for example, if we're at a farm and their primary farming activity is like a dairy and they produce milk and cheese, then we'll have like a cheese tasting at some point, and that will roll into lunch, and we'll utilize some of those products for lunch. And then for dinner, we'll sort of use the meat that's produced from the older dairy cows, and we'll kind of have a whole sort of theme and conversation about that throughout the meal. So I frame each meal that we're producing together because participants come into the kitchen and we cook together, but then we frame the meal with these different ideas that they've touched on throughout the day.
what do you think is the biggest aha for folks? Is it what's in the soil that is mesmerizing them, that they understand all of the microbes? What's the biggest, like, wow, I had no idea.
It's different for everybody. I mean, some people are really struck by the human component, by what it takes on a day-to-day basis, the physical nature of the work, the lack of perspective of the larger society on what farmers have to do on a day-to-day basis. A lot of people are struck by that. A lot of people come to it through a justice point of view too, and really want to understand the human component of what a regenerative system is. And it can't really be regenerative if there's a human toll that's like disproportional, right? Soil health is a big aha for a lot of people. There's certain courses where we actually have like microscopes and we'll sort of display what's happening in like super functional, high organic matter under soil and like super denuded, conventional, basically all mineral soil. And that's like a fence line photo, right? You know, this is what happens when you do it this way, and this is what happens when you do it a different way. It's very arresting for folks. And then just once you understand the science of soil health too, it just becomes so much clearer why it's important. I think another aha thing that folks tend to take away from it is that just the scale of it. You know, if someone's already shopping at a farmer's market and they buy organic, then they're doing all the right things, quote unquote, you know, is what they think when they start this educational opportunity. And then they realize the scale of the other side of the coin, and that can activate people in a whole different way.
People also get surprised on the community level in terms of I live here with whatever privilege I have access to all the food, but step a couple miles in that direction, and there's a tremendous amount of food insecurity, whether they understand what that means or not, meaning there's not even a supermarket within a certain number of miles, but also like the access to really fresh food is really diminished.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is where we start bumping into policy and state and local and federal regulations and how imperfect that whole system is. I think that's where a lot of people sort of like give up and lose perspective, and it feels too big to sort of wrap your head around. But then there's people who come into our courses too who are well versed on that stuff and provide nuance. And we will often give a talk, depending on where the course is, on the Farm Bill. One of our director of programs, Ryan Peterson, he basically studied the Farm Bill and policy doing his master's at UC Berkeley. And so he gives a nice sort of overview and a little bit of a deep dive on the implications of that and what the current sort of status of the Farm Bill is whenever we're giving the talk.
I think you're right. People have an appetite for some of it, but I think more conveniently, people like to use those headlines as either vilifying somebody or celebrating somebody, and maybe on both sides a little bit, prematurely or unfairly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that, just as a society, we've lost trust in our institutions because these are institutional scale things, and a single person can't be expected to hold it all, right? Which is why reform would be great, and to be able to trust our institutions more would be great also. But something that happens or tends to happen in the courses is like we give people a lot of information. We give them a lot of like high level information, ground level information. And we get to a point where people start to express anger, frustration, and dissatisfaction with status quo as they sort of onboard this new context, which is totally normal. And so then it becomes our focus to try to show what is working, what parts of the system are functioning, ways that people can actually apply their efforts and to create change. And I think because our system is sort of based on this, acting at a local level in conjunction with larger organizations, institutional partners, writing your congressman, like using the system as it is to feel like you can make your personal impact felt is one of the best ways to act. But also to see that your personal actions can impact your local community. We had a participant at our course last week who felt very driven to connect her local community with the farmers who grow their food. And so she's on this mission to create opportunities and experiences for farmers to connect with consumers at farmers markets, and an emerging sort of regional market system that's being built and designed in the town where she lives.
What's interesting here is how regenerative farming challenges the modern assumption that efficiency is always the highest goal. Industrial agriculture is incredibly efficient at producing volume, but the conversation reveals the hidden trade-offs under that efficiency: depleted soil, weakened local economies, disconnection from food sources, and dependence on fragile large-scale systems. What seems to surprise people is realizing that regenerative systems often look messier or slower on the surface because they're working with natural complexity rather than trying to eliminate it. In that sense, the courses seem to challenge a broader cultural mindset, the belief that faster, bigger, and more streamlined automatically means better. Instead, people begin seeing resilience, diversity, and local interconnectedness as forms of intelligence in themselves, not inefficiencies to optimize away.
One of the pieces that struck me when I was doing my course in Italy was just understanding sort of the spread of the kind of Western conventional agriculture model and how that has completely taken over Europe as well, and Eastern Europe, and probably in Asia and China. And the factory form of livestock rearing is ubiquitous globally at this point. And one of the things that I learned while I was in Italy is that like 90% of pigs are raised indoors in conventional CAFOs. And we have this perception in the US, I would say, and as someone who works in the culinary industry, I think I can speak to this, is that the perception is that when we see the little picture of the farm with the green photo on a packet of prosciutto coming from Italy, we kind of assume naively maybe that it's coming from a small producer where the pigs are outdoors eating acorns, all of these things. When in the reality, that is such a small slice of what the actual production is. And what was happening in Italy at the time was there was a swine flu going through, and that system is super fragile when viruses like this are going around, and that could destabilize the entire country's food supply and all these things. So you start to connect the dots between the consumer's perception of things and what the actual system is doing and how it got there. And it really helps you make different decisions. It really kind of like grounds that decision and helps you understand why you should be spending the extra money or putting out the extra effort.
Right, it's so interesting. It goes from local to global. So Climate Farm School's been going on for how long? And just give me an idea of the numbers of people that you're putting through the program every year.
I think it's something like 350 alumni at this point.
Do people come back and do it again and go to different places?
Yeah, we've had a couple people who've done that. We've had some folks who've taken like the Hudson Valley course domestically, and then they really enjoy the experience. And so they do our international course at Ballymaloe. We had one person who it was their second climate farm school experience, and one person in our Italy course had taken it in the Hudson Valley as well. So yeah, it's not common, but we also, through the alumni network, people have organized meetups independently of the organizers and connected with, we have a pretty good Bay Area sort of alumni group that has gotten together a number of times and done things and gone to screenings and done things together since we're Northern California based.
So what's on the horizon?
So we started as a program coming out of Terra, this climate education platform, and then transitioned as a member of the Idea Garden Institute, which is kind of an incubator for food system entrepreneurial organizations. And so we've been working and developing our nonprofit structure with the help of Idea Garden Institute. And through that, just kind of creating a more sustainable structure for the organization, which has been great. It's been amazing to be connected to funders and other organizations in the space doing similar work and seeing how other organizations function. And so this next year is about running courses, but also learning how to tell the story of Climate Farm School better. I think it's also like an evolving thing. It's so much about having people connect with each other and the land that it doesn't look the same way for everybody. And so we're very open to affirming people's experiences while they're in the course and just try to provide a platform for connection with other people and experts and farmers and guest speakers who we bring in to bring their information to each course. So it's really like a community building exercise. And that feels like a priority going forward.
I love the idea that if people couldn't get to a farm, that in their restaurants, they could have those expectations and those kinds of questions with people who are pretty close. They're close to they're close to food and sourcing. They know if they're getting it off a Cisco truck or if they're figuring out how to get it from a farmer with pastured pork.
Yeah, I think the role of the chef is multidimensional. And, I worked at Chez Panisse for a long time, which was sort of this like origin of the farm to table movement and sourcing directly from farmers as a way to subvert the conventional system. And so I am predisposed to think in a certain way about how food should be sourced and how it should be prepared and how it should be presented to anybody, be it your family or the guests when you're working in a restaurant. And so I know that my perspective is unique, and I often say I live in a bubble within a bubble, but I think it's pretty universal to recognize that food is a way to nurture others, and it's also a great way to tell stories and connect people to their history, and all of that can be very meaningful. And so maybe chefs do have a responsibility to kind of communicate some of that through their food and through the businesses that they're trying to operate.
I know there are chefs who are taking on that responsibility, but I think it goes from both sides. If the consumers are being, I'm going out to dinner, I want to know. And the chefs are also meeting me maybe halfway and saying, I'm a chef, but I'm proud to give you this because I love this farm. And I think that the pork that they create is the best, and for all these reasons and why that's meaningful. It doesn't have to be every item on the menu, right? Like that you're focused on, but if they have the opportunity to get one story across, that'd be great.
Yeah, I have a lot of empathy for small business owners too, which is why I have so much empathy for farmers who I feel like, oh man, they're at the end of the food chain, right? They're at the end of the supply chain. And it's so hard to be a farmer. And so it feels a little whiny to say that I also have a lot of empathy for chefs and small business owners of restaurants and things like that. It's already so hard to operate those businesses on the margins that are expected. But I think we do have a responsibility to represent the concerns of the producers because we couldn't do what we do without them and vice versa. And so we should use whatever sort of opportunities we have to communicate those priorities about responsible stewardship and celebrating the farmers who do things the quote unquote the right way. I interact with a fair number of people in the food system, and I'm always trying to keep in context how hard it is to run a small business while also living your values.
What I appreciated most about this conversation with Gary is that it reminds us that food systems don't change because everyone suddenly becomes a farmer. They change because enough people become curious. Some people attend a climate farm school course. Some people join a CSA. Some people ask questions at the farmer's market. Some people choose a restaurant that prioritizes local sourcing. Some people become chefs who tell the stories of the farms behind their menus. And that matters, because while only a small percentage of Americans grow food, every one of us eats. Every one of us participates in the food system every single day. Gary talked about people arriving at Climate Farm School through different doors: concern about climate change, or a health challenge, becoming a parent, or simply wanting to understand where their food comes from. What they often leave with is something bigger than information. They leave with context. They begin to see the connections between soil, food, farmers, communities, and the choices that they make every single day. I also think this conversation highlights an important role for chefs. More than half of America's food dollars are spent through restaurants. If we leave chefs out of the conversation about the future of food, we're leaving out one of the most powerful opportunities for education and influence. The best chefs don't just feed people. They help people understand food differently. And maybe that's where real change happens. Not because every consumer becomes an expert, not because every restaurant becomes perfect, but because a relatively small group of engaged people starts asking better questions, building closer relationships, and bringing others along with them. That's how movements grow. One conversation, one meal, one farm, one bite at a time. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope that you will leave a 5-star rating and, even better, a written review on Apple Podcasts. It helps more people discover these conversations and helps us continue bringing farmers, chefs, researchers, advocates, and food systems leaders to the table. One Bite is Everything is now in the top 3% of podcasts globally, with more than 150 episodes and listener engagement that exceeds 88% of shows on Spotify. That's because listeners like you continue to share these conversations with others. Thank you so much to my co-producer, Sonia Dillon, and to sound engineer, Russell Chapa. The original music is all his. So good. I'm your host, Dana DePrima, and this is One Bite is Everything. I'll see you here again next week. Until then, eat like it matters, because it does.